Wachari Nation Building Monday live. It is my pleasure, as always, to be with you all on a Monday evening and discussing all things Wachari, discussing nation building, discussing getting back to our roots, getting back to basics. And this evening, we are joined by, as usual, Brother Marley Chatier, and as well, we have Brother Jerry Enriquez. Some might be familiar with him from his writings in the newspaper. He is also active on Facebook. I am also familiar with him in terms of mindfulness. And so we will be covering quite a bit, but the focus of our discussion primarily with Brother Jerry is in relation to his take on our history as Garinago, this work of nation building that we are engaged in here at Wachari. We always want to tap into the expertise, the knowledge, the work that our people have done over the years, because all of it is important to nation building. And so it is my pleasure to have him here with us and to engage this discussion with him. And so I want to say good night to both him and Marley. Welcome to our Monday Live. And let's get right into it. I know that, Brother Jerry, you have been writing quite a bit in relation to Garifuna history. And when Baba Roy was here with us, he himself mentioned you and some work that you had done. You have a publication. I am privileged to have your book. I don't know if you have more books, but I know I was blessed to have one of them. And it spoke, of course, about education and our involvement in education in Belize as a people. And so welcome to our Monday Live. It is a pleasure to have you here with us, and I'm sure this will not be your last visit with us. So give us a little background on yourself for the benefit of those who don't know much about Jerry Enriquez.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you. As you mentioned rightly so, we've met during workshops that I've conducted on mindfulness, and that is one of the things that I've advocated for practice in Belize, in the schools, in the workplace, in the homes. I very certainly believe that the scientific mind health practice will make a tremendous difference in Belize if it is introduced and practiced through the schools, and it is going to shift the mind state of generations. What we're seeing today is calls for a lot of healing of the mind, and it has to be approached beyond an intellectual level, but from an experiential mindfulness practice approach. But that aside, I'm originally from PG. I was born in PG. I grew up in PG. My entire formative years was in PG, which I'm very proud of. I'm an eldest of 7 children. My father is Mr. Solomon Enriquez. Those in PG, the elders in PG would remember him. He was a photographer, an educator. He also had a newsletter called a newsletter for, I just can't recall the name just now, but it promoted development, a lot of development issues in the discussion of a lot of development issues in PG. My mother also is from PG, both Garifuna. My father came from a long line of teachers, and I will talk about that a little more when I talk about my book. My mother, who was born in Guatemala, in Bananera, of Belizean parents, returned and went to school in PG. So I used to be a teacher also. That was the kind of way in which Garifuna young persons were formed. Many went through to high school and then to teach in rural communities. That was the pattern of development in those days for Garifuna persons. Government service jobs tended to be closed to qualified Garifuna persons. I guess as a result of discrimination of British colonialism, where government jobs, especially senior government positions, and to a large extent it is like that today, are reserved for a certain class connected with the colonial elites. So that aside, I taught for a few years in the primary school system, in the high school system, went abroad, did a lot of intense studies. I went through teachers college as a trained teacher, went abroad to study psychology, sociology, later economics, and of course history was a very favorite subject of mine right through undergraduate and graduate years. I appreciated the importance of understanding historical facts and contexts to get all angles of history to make important decisions for the future. So that's kind of a background of who I am.
Well, it's a rich story, rich history. I hope that you intend also to publish it in, of course, greater detail.
Yeah,
We need to do more of our writing, our own stories,
yes,
as opposed to having to refer to what others have written of us, their perceptions of us, or what they have taken from us by way of research. It is long
definitely.
overdue that we write our own stories, because
Of
there's a lot,
course.
Right.
clearly, in the career path that you have pursued. There's a lot of information that you have gathered yourself
And
about
then
our people, from our people,
exactly.
that you could also be publishing, apart from what you did with your family, no?
One of the things I used to do when I used to teach in the school, or especially when I started teaching at the primary school level, was to, and I really strongly encourage it, was to have my students get into the communities with historical questions and speak with the elders to find out what life used to be. It is amazing when students go out to meet elders and speak about what used to be in their communities. And when they come back, they compile a rich story of life as it was in those days. I did that as a personal initiative as a teacher. It wasn't like, and I would strongly recommend for teachers to be able to connect students with their roots. What has happened usually in schools is that students remain isolated in the learning process. They're disconnected from themselves, they're disconnected from others, they're disconnected from their community, and they're disconnected from nature. And then they grow up disconnected, and we wonder why society is the way it is. And disconnection breeds a lot of division, it breeds a lot of judgmental attitude, and it fails to really connect people into what a community should truly be, caring, loving, and where people care for each other. And so I often say that the breakdown of our society often starts with that kind of a disconnect and individualistic, compartmentalized way of thinking.
How did we get there?
Yeah.
How did we get to that?
It did not happen overnight. It's a consistent process, and I say through the education system, because education can make profound change and transformation. And we got there when first our system seems to still be locked in a very academic colonial way, and rather than nurture a fuller human being. And so if people grow up like that, right through an education system, it becomes like normal and natural for people to disconnect and live in this kind of competitive way and tear down each other. But also there's influence of family that has that could have that behavior. And so especially in in communities that were once rich in their own cultural formations, in their own cultural values. It seems like development is now defined as plus culture minus development, plus development minus culture. So people tend to be viewed as the more developed and educated you are, the
Less
less
cultured.
connected you are with your own traditional cultures, when it doesn't have to be that way.
I
So,
Right.
I fully agree. I fully agree with you.
If I may interject here,
Yes.
this connection that Brother Enriquez is talking about, it's obvious. You can see this connection among us, and hence the reason why we emphasize on nation building, because while we're building a nation, that connection needs to be made, and it's important. Also, you mentioned you taught mindfulness, all of it encompass to get to the point of building a nation. So I see the disconnect as a problem. So while we're building a nation, I think we should pay serious attention to that disconnection and see how we can connect it. It appears that Brother Enriquez is full of knowledge, because the show just started and he already said a mouth full. If you know what I mean. If
thanks,
so,
thank you.
yeah. So yeah, sorry to interrupt you just now, but I had to point out that disconnect part when we mention disconnect, because it's obvious, it's everywhere, and if we are building a nation, that disconnect must be solved before we move forward.
I'm glad you
Well,
mentioned.
I don't think we would be needing to build a nation again, right? Had that disconnection not taken place.
Right.
So
Right,
this is it. It's the effect of colonization.
exactly.
It's the negative impact of colonization, because it's not like education did not exist within our societies before the arrival of Europeans. And it's imperative that we understand that societal institution, it exists in every society, and it may exist in different forms. It might have a different focus or appearance, but it doesn't make it any less valuable. So for us, our education was focused back then on our survival,
Mhm.
and it had its fundamental principles at its base, at its foundation, that then also influenced every other aspect of life. So if you were going to be farming, there was definitely there was a curriculum. There were courses you needed to take in order to successfully, first of all, identify fertile land and establish a relationship with that land, and then start to cultivate it. And
Mhm.
that included all of the wildlife there, the plants, the worms, the whatever animals were in that area, all of it. The moon,
Mhm.
knowing the moon, and that was also imperative when it came to our nautical skills as well,
Mhm.
or cutting down
That's right.
lumber for whatever it is that we were making.
Mhm.
We would cut at a particular time. If we're going to build, you're still going to cut at a particular time, because if the wood was not this particular way at this particular time, then the quality of the end product would be poor, so there was definitely
That was our
our
education.
education,
And
and
that
it
is,
was
Right.
valuable education.
of
what
course, and
we what we produced back then is of much higher quality even than some
Mhm.
of the things that we have, that's made from especially wood and so on today. It doesn't have the same, but then there was also that, I think, pride, that that feeling of accomplishment. This is coming from my core
Mhm.
source. There's a connection between me and the earth, and so making this thing is not just I'm doing it for a job, I'm doing it for income. This is who I am. This is
Of
a
course.
part of my identity. So when we got to where we adopted this new education, it undermined what our true education actually stood for. And unfortunately, this education created the disconnection.
Exactly. And
Part
you
of it,
mentioned
yes.
quite a, you're right on point with mentioning that. And in fact, when I was talking about the education system, for example, there's a tendency in the school culture for teachers to either overtly or subtly remind their students that if they're not doing well in school, they will end up to be farmers or plumbers or in a way to look at other skills as very condescending, in a very condescending way. And therefore, students are subtly programmed to be seeing those other ways in which their own communities survive. There's a tendency to look down on that, to say, well, I am through this school system. I'm finished with school now, so I can't go farm. I can't touch the soil. I have to sit in an office, in an AC room, to cool myself from the dress style of a suit and tie in a tropical country, kind of. So there's a gross reprogramming within the school system for students who will become later citizens to limit themselves from being creative, productive citizens of society. Why can't they still not do farming and do plumbing and do other work and be a well-rounded individual? So as you mentioned, those are kinds of the things that are destroyed in the school system. Could be destroy creativity, productivity, and a deep connection with self. And I remember Mr. Nunes mentioning mindfulness is a way of reconnecting with self, because there's a high value we tend to put on the intellectual achievement, but there's a whole other part of the mind that is left closed and it is not tapped. And it affects the way we see the world. People could be highly educated and highly skilled, but still very ignorant of the important values of life that makes for a better society. So development and nation building is more than just intellectual achievement, but it is a reconnection with self, with others, with community, nature, and bringing people together with in-depth understanding of each other, in-depth goodwill in our connection, and a way to find ways to heal all the divisiveness, all the kind of divisiveness in language, divisiveness in action, and trying and tearing down people. A lot of people are hurt and need much healing, and we need to find ways to be able to have people reconnect with themselves and find the healing within themselves. So I come from that kind of a thinking, and there's a lot of people walking out anger, and hurt people are going to continue to hurt people intentionally or unintentionally. It happens through their words, their actions, and the way they interact with others. And they become closed-minded and defensive, and therefore learning cannot continue. There's a lot of blockage in learning facts, lots of blockage because of a lot of ego that is involved. And so the process is not genuine when people work from a position of defending ego or defending this bruised self and a lot of pain that is within. So that's kind of the background. That's a lot that I try to pack into one,
Yes.
but it is why I strongly promote a new way of healing, tried and tested scientific way for people to really clear out those past, sometimes intergenerational pain and trauma that have been a part of their whole being. The body is a record of everything that is in the mind. And so sometimes from childhood, sometimes even from before, from pregnancy, there is trauma that could be passed on. That is why I will strongly recommend that people really take care of themselves, because who you are, what you do with yourselves, is being stored in your body. It becomes a part of your DNA information, and whatever you do to yourself will affect the generations that you produce. So whether a mother during pregnancy have to be very careful about what she's doing, what she's saying, and the father also have to be very careful how he treats that mother, because that child is precious, and whatever you do is going to register into that newborn for better or for worse, and for immediate impact or long-term impact. And so each person must be careful about how they treat themselves. So when you do that, then you're already being careful as to what you say to others, what you say to the community, the openness in which you treat information towards learning and healing is very important. What is most dangerous is passing information that is not based on facts and it is not grounded. You could cause more division and destruction, and then eventually falsehood will not produce genuine foundations for development.
I find there's a comment here that I want to share that is I find very profound from one of our viewers, Lucia Guiti. She says, as a Garifuna from Labuga, I was always assigned to spend time with elder aunties and who would take me to Arabu or farm. They taught me of our survival, culture, gastronomy, planting our food. Cassava is important for our survival, our music, rituals. They kept me grounded. I have a master's degree and worked in the matrix rat race. What kept me grounded was my Garifuna values and principles.
Beautiful,
And
well said.
I love it. I love this
That's
comment
amazing.
because it's about that balance, striking that balance. To me, that linear way of thinking, this either or, this black or white, it's definitely Eurocentric. It is not us.
Of course.
It's not us at all. And I think that was the biggest mistake, or one of, from that education that we took on, that came from the colonizer, that then was an education against ourselves, essentially. When it should have been, because if you think about education in its purest sense, because every society has education, if you think about it in its purest sense, then even learning from the European standpoint, whatever they were bringing should have been able to enhance us. But since they did not certainly come with the intention to enhance us, so whatever they were sharing was cherry picking what they thought we should know, and whatever it is that they thought we should know and therefore taught to us was against us. Exactly. Essentially, it was against us. So then there was no balance struck there.
I think it was a big misstep when we weaponized the education that we got from the European masters against our traditional value, and they will lose who we are and adopt that new culture, forgetting what made us who we are. And it's a dangerous thing. It's still going on. I wish everyone could see it like tomorrow and wake up and say, hey, something is not right here. These guys at Wachari, they're doing something traditional. Let me support it. But instead, most people would say, oh, we don't want to go into farming. We have degrees now. What Lucia, her name is? Sorry if I'm mentioning it wrong.
Lucia
she have a master's degree, and yet still she understands what it means to do farming. And what more than that do you need?
And that is why when I was teaching in the school system, I made sure every time I had this assignment, you must go out to talk with people in your community, people you might have never met, people you tend to ignore. There are elders sitting alone at home with a wealth of information and knowledge. And I insist for their assignment, you must go and you talk to these persons. Draft out your own questions, find out. You can't sit in a classroom and expect to be taught your history when your history is right out there in the community, and you need to gather that for yourself. And I hope that that passed on some kind of tools for those students that I taught to be able to, in the future, not think of history as something that they have to read in a book, but they could go out and talk to people. And in fact, when I used to do a lot of consultancies, and I insist in every consultancy I do, I have to talk with the people who are affected by the project. So just the idea of connecting with people, hearing their voices, knowing what they're thinking and they're saying is a very important part of nation building. So you had asked me about my book.
Yes, I had asked you about it.
So I
Baba Roy had mentioned it, right? He had made
really
reference to it because of the historical references to us and how we were impacted by this education system that essentially what we thought was going to equip us, no? But essentially it did create that division because, and that disconnection, because what happened was the uprooting of our brightest, and then they were taken elsewhere to then educate others, leaving us basically that was the experience of brain drain. This was internal brain drain within the boundaries of the country. Brain drain before the other brain drain that happened with people leaving the country. There was brain drain from our villages.
Right. Well, first I have to be very grateful to Roy for his constant nudging of me to write this book. I had found some old manuscripts written by my grandmother and my grandfather in my home. It was locked up in storage that my father had as like precious documents, but he passed away and I had access to it. And I found these old exercise books. The cover of the exercise books has King George VI. That's the British king at the time. And that was part of the whole, all school exercise books had King George VI on the cover. And so I found this story and I went through it, very fascinating story about their own personal experiences written in their own journals. As my grandfather and grandmother traveled through various rural communities in Belize to serve, when he served as principal of the school and she went along as his wife. Very remote communities, like they served in Criquesarco, they served in Barranco, they served in what was then Topco, also in San Ignacio. So you see the movement, Progreso Village. So the San Antonio is where they spent the longest, and I think San Antonio Village in the Toledo district still has my grandfather as the longest serving principal in that community. I'll get back to that. But just to say that after I found this manuscript, I had mentioned it to Roy, I mentioned it to Dr. Palacio, and then I kind of just left it aside as a story just for me. I thought it wasn't probably that useful for anybody else. And they started the spark. When are you going to publish it? When are you going to publish it? People need to know this kind of story because it is an experience of many Garifuna teachers in those days. So I have to give him a very big thank you always. I'm very grateful for his encouragement, along with Dr. Palacio, John Nunez, and there was a family friend of mine, Mrs. Pauline Sylvester, who is the wife of Mr. Lawrence Sylvester. She took this manuscript at a time when there were hardly any computers. I remember when you used to use computers on Shift F7, Shift F1, those kind of things in those days. And she went and she typed the whole manuscript. So that was a start. And then 15 years later was when the book was published. I went through and I put it in historical context. I contextualized it looking at the history of Garifuna people or the Garinago in southern Belize from the time there was their settlement in southern Belize and the very important role they played, two critical and important role that Garifuna played in laying the foundation of Belize. The first important role was in the economic development of Belize and the expansion of Belize to the southern territory beyond this, from the Seboon to the Sarstoon. They played a critical role because at the time around the late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a high demand for mahogany in Europe. And there was a shortage of labor. The shortage of labor came because there was a lot of escape of enslaved Africans who the white settlers depended for labor. As a result, Garifuna men were brought in from Roatan, about 150 of them around 1802, but there were still presence as early as 1799 to harvest mahogany from Seboon River south. And so they harvested. So by 1802, in fact, there was British presence all the way to Deep River. And then by the time they reached Sarstoon around 1816 or so. But just to show the intense labor that happened, there was a boost in export, there was a boost in earnings for the settlement, and that stabilized the settlement of Belize. Without that labor, Belize settlement would probably not have survived these economic challenges. So the fresh influx of labor.
Brother Enriquez,
yes.
To get something clear, you're saying there is a boost in labor due to Garinago coming into the picture?
Yes, yes, definitely so. And so they played a very critical role in the expansion of Belize from the Seboon to the Sarstoon. So that's one role. I could go into more details into that, but let me get into the second very important role. Was the Catholic Church selected the best and the brightest Garifuna men and deployed them to remote communities all over Belize as agents of the church to spread Catholicism. And as educators, they were taken out of their communities, the best and the brightest. So that left our communities with that sort of a gap in leadership in a sense, but they were served by white priests and nuns who were kept in the towns. The preference was to keep the foreign missionaries within the town system and deploy Garifuna teachers to all the remote areas of Belize. And this happened since the 1880s, 1890s, around that period of time. Way up for almost a century, Garifuna teachers, first men and then later on women in these remote areas to teach the other ethnic groups of people who lived in these remote areas. My grandfather, whose writing is in this book, this is what the book looks like. There's the cover of my grandfather, my grandmother, and my father and family. His uncle had influenced him to get into teaching first in town as a pupil teacher, Antonio Enriquez. This was when my grandfather was a teenager. He started as a pupil teacher, and then he was selected to go to San Antonio to open the school over there. At that time, there were various attempts to open the school in San Antonio, in Toledo, and the attempts failed because, one, the people did not want a school, and they were in a way hostile to any outsider going in there to try to open a school. So my grandfather made a promise to the priest that he will be the one to stick it through, to remain there through thick and thin, to open the school. The school was a way to stabilize the community also, because the life of the people at that time was sort of nomadic. They stayed in the community for a number of years. They do their farming, and when there was, as soon as the soil was depleted, they moved to another area, and they moved to various areas. So the school, and setting up a school there would have been a way to get the community stable, to stabilize the community.
Mm-hmm.
When my grandfather got there, surely he met very hostile, challenging treatment. He spoke in the book about, even though there was arrangement that the priest made, that a family would host and feed him when he showed up for meals, sometimes the ladies just railing at him. Why does he have to be in the village? Dash the food at him, give him the most, give him his food with a lot of insults. And he had to swallow his pride. He had to swallow his pride because of the promise. Many nights he cried as the only young man in that village, a Garifuna man, trying very hard to get the school started. So he spoke about those struggles. My grandmother also joined him later on. She got married to him when she was 16, he was 25, and she was taken to that village. And she spoke about adjusting to life in the village, to a new culture, to washing in the river, to learning new foods, to learn a new language, all of those things. And as they moved from one community to the next, they went through that same adjustment process. But what is more important about the book is not that it is about the story of my grandfather and grandmother, but several Garifuna teachers went through similar experiences with their families. And for example, Roy Cayetano spoke about his experience when he wrote a foreword to the book. And he shared that experience moving to Santa Teresa and having to paddle up the Moho River. Garifuna families sacrificed tremendously as they moved around to these communities to carry a Catholic education system that was imparted to them by the priest at the time. They were trained by various Jesuit priests to be not just teachers, but catechists. They took on various roles in the community as counselors. They also had to, in a way, deputize for the priests and do church services regularly, funeral services. All those were the responsibilities of the teacher at the time.
So would you agree with the statement that we were essentially used as instruments of the colonization process?
In both the state and the church, we were used as instruments in the colonization process, and in a way that was detrimental to us in the long term. So while we, in a sense, benefited in a sort of educated way, intellectual education, in a way that teaching at that time gave persons a kind of standing and status in the community. And then the learning itself became beneficial in some ways, but in other ways, it disconnected us from our own culture and language. The teachers tended to come back and speak only English at home. they followed the instruction of the church to discourage in some ways in the communities the speaking of their language, but at the same time they learned a lot of the languages in the various communities that they serve. My father became an interpreter of Maya in the Magistrate and Supreme Court, and so was his sister, my aunt Olive. They spoke Mopan Maya, Ekchi, a little bit of Yucatec Maya, Spanish, all the languages in Belize I heard within my home. I used to think it was a normal thing until I learned that no, they learned it along the way as they served various communities.
Mm-hmm. Well, this brings me to this
Wow.
quote from Audre Lorde,
Mm-hmm.
very prominent poet, Black feminist, lesbian advocate. She made this presentation titled "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And
Yes,
she
I remember that.
says, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change."
Mm.
And from the first time, and it was years ago that I had first read this, from the first time it stood out to me, I accepted it to be true. Because indeed, when I asked the question, would you agree that we were instruments of the colonization process? Isn't that a major irony? Wouldn't our ancestors from Urume flog us for doing that? Because they were certainly very cognizant who their enemies were. And under no circumstance would we have participated in our own self-destruction by being the tools used by these people that wanted to master us. And it is because of our resistance to that they eventually removed us from our homeland. So to come now to the new space that we then had to establish ourselves in, and be the subjects of the change they wanted that was against us. That's a major crisis. And I don't know to what extent we recognize that, but that's why I'm saying it here. Because if we understand our history and we understand what our ancestors had resisted so vehemently in Urume, and if we had embraced that understanding and maintained that understanding in the face of their continued assault, just in I'd say a subtle way, or this was just another way to do what they did to us in Urume, but they did it blatant and violently. So now they came subtly. They used economics and education and religion, right, against us, and had us become participants now in this very same scheme. You
But
know
yeah, at the same
how
time, though,
yes.
we cannot discount the really smart role that our people played in all of this. It was we had to survive, so
Yes.
we knew our history of being exiled. We knew that we were in a new space, but we had to find ways to survive, which included working in the timber industry, included teaching. But at the same time, there was some resistance for us to maintain our spirituality and our language, which survives incredibly to this day, even though there is a decline. But the mere fact that we have reached this far with our language, our music, our spirituality had to do with very strong resistance given the onslaught of the colonizers in every way, onslaught through the church, onslaught through the state, we found a way to survive. So we cannot just discount ourselves to say, well, the colonizers did this to us, when in fact, really, our role was in a kind of a very smart way. Even on our spirituality, for example, the church wanted to eliminate that. So the compromise was made to, well, let's include some aspects of the church just for it to survive, and we still maintain it to survive. So we kind of a, in a sense, guerrilla kind of tactic, if I may use that term. There was a lot of smarts to how we survived. So
well, I hear
remember,
it says that smart is for crooks and thieves, right? So let's stay strategic. Let's stay strategic.
I wanted to say that term, but I didn't want. Yeah, very strategic.
I look at it this way. We just been banished from our homeland, Yerume, by these same people. We came to this side of the world, and we came in contact with them again. Not forgetting what they have done to us. I believe our ancestors make that conscious decision to get themselves in line with the program that they impose on them without forgetting who they really are.
Exactly.
Like, as you mentioned, we still have our spirituality, our language, our dance. They never put that aside, but they had to compromise to survive dealing with these people again.
Right,
so
right.
Yeah, I won't put the full blame on our ancestors, because they did what they need to do for us to be here today.
Exactly. And it was very deliberately strategic amidst every force to try to eliminate them, their language, their culture, and who they were. For example, when they first came to Belize, to the settlement of Belize, and then moved to the southern territory that was not yet Belize, but was being advanced upon for future formation of the country of Belize. The enslaved Africans were told very specifically that we were devil worshippers, we were into witchcraft and all of this. We were cannibals. I was surprised that even a few weeks ago there was someone in PG, white settler in PG, who was saying he found new evidence that Garifuna are really cannibals. I didn't take that too kindly, but just to say that there are people who still have that historical thing. But to go back, we were even banned from being in the settlement of Belize because of the influence that we might have on the enslaved Africans to foment rebellion. And so there were strict laws for us to keep south of the Sibun. And if we were to enter the settlement, we need a permit, and that permit was for 48 hours. If we were caught in the settlement without a permit, we were thrown in jail. So there were those strict laws to keep us apart, not only physically, but mentally. For generations, mentally meant that the two black groups of Belize must be kept divided, and it has had some devastating effects on what is now the whole population structure of Belize, when it is unfortunate that the colonial masters sowed seeds of deep division between the two black groups. And they carried that, many of them carried that for generations, and that has destroyed and kept us divided.
I'd like to interject.
Let me just one more point to say that with all of that, we still survive. And thanks to those who are not fully infected by the colonial system of education. I say fully infected meant they were the ones who carried the culture to what it is today. And so we have to be also grateful for their way of being strategic to survive.
Yes, and I definitely support that. I fully agree with that and acknowledge it, that our traditions, the depth of our wisdom survived that attack on our spirituality and our understanding of ourselves, so that despite what efforts were made to alienate us from our source, we still remained grounded as a people in our spirituality. Now, it isn't without threat. The threat remains. Even now with the evangelicals and all of that, that attack on our spirituality it continues. But I asked for the interjection because when you spoke earlier about facts and history, now some of the things that have been stated as facts in history are lies, and we have blundered in repeating some of those lies. So, for example, when the British told their enslaved population of Afro-descendants that Garinagu, at the time they called us Black Caribs, were devil worshippers, that we engaged in witchcraft. Well, this was their enslaved population. These were people they had control over. And so they could tell them anything. But any thinking person would have known the lie in that statement. Why? Because it is in our historical records that in 1790 or 91, at the time Garinagu were in Yorume, in our homeland. We were in our homeland. But the public meeting established a law outlawing or making illegal and punishable by death obia, right? Which was, of course, African religious retention. And anything that was associated with ancestral worship or animism or anything that was non-white was seen as a threat. Anything that would bring the people together and make them feel empowered enough to stand up for themselves was seen as a threat, which is why the punishment was death. So for them to turn around, 10 years later, and any time after that, to say, oh, these people are engaged in that behavior, when they were already punishing their own enslaved population for engaging in anything that looked like honoring their ancestors or what they described as devil worship and so on. So when you know the historical fact, this is what I, as a historian, like to make sure I take every opportunity to share with audiences, share with our people the truth. We need to tell the truth. So I also like your use of the word infection, that we were not infected, because they described us, again, the same British, when we came here, and then they wanted to eliminate us again the same way that they had done, the same attitude that they had in Urume. So now they want to remove us again, right? They already removed us from our home, Now they want to remove us again from their settlement because we're a threat. We're going to lead their slave population into insurrection. They're going to have revolts because of these people who are infected, they said, infected with the disease of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Now, why would liberty, why would fraternity, equality, any of those things be bad? Because when you hear infection and disease, that's bad. It's not good for you.
Bad infection.
Yeah, but then they're saying these things, the very thing that was at the core of us as a people, that we were a united people, that we saw each other as equals, and that there was that Aubon Amuruno concept and principle by which we live. That was our foundation. Even though that references to the French Revolution, they aligned us with the French and so on. But fundamentally, that was how we lived, and they treated it as if though it was a bad thing, that we were united, that we saw each other as equals, and that we looked out for each other, that was our way. And they did not want their enslaved population to start to think that way, because of course we would have helped our brethren and sisters. Of course.
It's all a part. It's a part of the whole colonial strategy of divide and rule. The strategy would never work if divisions were not created, because in the first place, the white settlers were the minority in this entire settlement. So in order for them to survive, they had to find ways to keep the two groups divided. And that gave them the power that they had, divide and rule. And always fanning that division is what allowed them to remain. And wherever they went, that was the strategy, divide and rule. The unfortunate thing is that in the long term, that kind of division that we have among ourselves is splintering us, and is continuing to hurt us. There's a mental division, there's all the negativity, the backbiting, the kind of bringing down internally or abroad against those at home. Those kinds of division very publicly is going to continue to hurt us, because people could play on that and continue to weaken whatever cause that we have to try to work on ourselves, to build ourselves, and to heal and to reunite ourselves. We have to be very, very careful of the way, well, we have to, in a sense, let go of our stubborn egos and to look at the big picture as to how to create this unity. And sometimes it will entail swallowing our pride, giving up our own selfish motives, and to find ways to reconnect with our people in those things that matter, to heal and to develop ourselves. And that starts with our own personal spirituality, in our connection and rootedness in ourselves. And it starts with our community spirituality, how we connect with people in ways that are healing and nurturing and empowering. That is what held our people together in the times of struggle in Urume, when they migrated to Belize, when they settled in Belize. Even as we were growing up, just the elders looking out for each other and taking care of that is continuing to erode, and that is causing a lot of weakness and pain in our communities.
You are so on point with that. And when you had mentioned earlier about the need for healing, that is where I see it, because now we are indeed plagued with the disease of individuality. Yeah. We are plagued with the disease of capitalism, of greed,
right,
and that mistrust of each other, and yes, egos and all of it. We need to heal that, because if we are going to build our nation, really and truly build it to its maximum potential, then there has to be a solid foundation, and there can't be a divided foundation. The foundation cannot have cracks in it, it cannot have gaps in it, it cannot have any spaces in it. It has to be cohesive. And so that is the work of having these types of discussions, very sensible, meaningful, thought-provoking, deep discussions that our people have access to, that then hopefully will help us to unlearn the lies and relearn what we have lost that was fundamental. So it's bridging gaps. I think that That's what needs to be happening consistently. And in these types of discussions, that's what we hope will happen, is that gaps will be bridged. Because when the descent happened, the only way that the colonizer could have been successful in the divide and conquer is when the divided and the conquered did not speak to each other.
Mm-hmm.
As long as we got in contact with each other and saw that this was the plot against us,
Mm-hmm.
there could be no more division and conquering.
Mm-hmm.
There could only be unity. And that is what needs to be happening now, is for us to recognize where the division and where the conquering is taking place and bridge those gaps.
If those gaps are not bridged, that continues to degrade our way of being. Even as we talk to, for example, communal land rights, communal or customary land rights have to do with how people get together to be able to preserve their way of life in the use of their land and their resources. Um, and if we look at how it used to be, people went to their plantations and their farms, the women bring their cassava, there was some sharing in the community. But the very existence of a people in a communal land rights setting implies that there is community, there is cohesiveness, there is a system of leadership to protect the customary ways of living as it relates to the resources. But if people are individualistic and splintered, and there is a lack of communal values, Aubu Amuruno, if that continues, that affects everything else.
Yeah.
And so how do we rebuild our communal system, our way of caring about each other and for each other? That defines us as a people. But the more we splinter and are divided and are gone from the resources around us and disconnected, then the weaker and more broken our people will be. I remember I used to very strongly invite those from abroad to come and reconnect with people on the ground as we try to build a concerted effort towards a customary land rights system within our communities. If the communities are splintered with a lot of individualism, that has to heal in order to develop the other systems that we are trying to achieve. You cannot build a common system of communal ownership and values when people are broken into individual pieces and are not healed, or it is bound to fail. No matter how much effort is put into it, we have to build organizations, groups, communities, families to get together to be able to sustain it. That is how it works. In all the experiences I've had with people working together to preserve with a passion what is their value system, and they work as if their life depended on it, and their life really depends on it, their life and culture. So those are important things that I'd like to have in consideration when people work towards customary land rights achievement. It has to draw in communities consistently in the discussion for communities to take ownership, and it has to have a leadership system within the communities, from the communities, who are propelling and generating that interest to stand firm, to have that respected and preserved. If that does not happen, then all efforts will not be able to be sustained through broken communities. It has to be consistently communal, community-based, with a system of leadership that are working together to preserve those values.
Excellent. And it is quite a fitting note for us to end off this week on and to continue next week on, because that to me is the key right now. We recognize where we have been misled, miseducated, where the division, the distancing and all of that has happened. And to me, that is the first step in the healing process, is recognizing what's wrong.
Right.
This is what is ailing me. And so this is what now we need to do, or the answers are coming to us, especially if we tap into our spirituality, the answers are coming to us. This is what we need in order to heal. This is the bath that needs to be taken. This is the herb that needs to be drunk. This is the cleansing that needs to happen. And having these types of discussions to educate our people, and a lot of the comments tonight have been very appreciative of the wealth of knowledge that has been shared. And I'm imploring all those that are listening, all those that are viewing us, share this. Share this. Right now we're at 4 shares, but share it. If all the comments, if we get the 21 comments to be shared, if it's shared, that's all the more people of us getting the information. Inbox this to people, because this is what we need. We are getting back to ourselves. This isn't like we're taking on something new and strange. This is getting back to where we were, because we lived like this before. We had this in place already. This isn't a new thing we're taking on. We didn't learn it from other people. This is how we were.
And this is what we had to relearn. We need a process of unlearning and relearning.
Right.
To get that
So that's what we're talking about next week. The process of unlearning and relearning.
Okay, so let me leave at, I think we're about closing now. I'll leave two things. I will not leave without taking the opportunity to encourage people to buy and read the book. It's called To Educate a Nation, Autobiography of Andres P. and Jane V. Enriquez. You could find it on Amazon. It could be at, if you're in Belize, Brody's store, downtown Belize City, and on the highway, in Belmopan, Daker Stationery and Books. In Dangriga, Mr. Oscar Ramirez Chatouillet store also carries the books. In PG, Flo Johnson Stationery and Stationery and Books, I think is the name of her store. So the book is available. And if it is not, find a way to inbox me and I could find a way to get it to you. But it provides important historical information, kind of not very comprehensive, but it gives some very, very clear start of our further discussion. But what is fascinating is to look at what teachers have been through in the sacrifices that they've made in educating Belize, and through the eyes and the experiences of my grandfather and grandmother. So I strongly recommend that. It provides for an in-depth understanding on history from that perspective. Secondly, if I may leave this very short exercise as a way to reconnect with self. If people could spend about 15 to 20 minutes in silence every morning and every night, doing nothing, just sitting in silence, no music, no nothing, and that's just as a way to be aware of the inclinations and processes in your mind without reacting to it, is a good start to reconnect with self. It's a mindfulness practice, but everybody, and you could Google on YouTube various mindfulness practices. But the point is, people must be able to disconnect from the rat race and the constant chattering of the mind. If you're not aware of it, the kind of lifestyle that people live produces very constant chattering in the background, and they're not aware. And so that is why they resist new information. They're not able to think in depth with very clear analysis. They're there's a lot of resistance to change. Sometimes they produce more pain to others.
Too much psychological noise.
A lot. And so just being able to pause each day and be still and quiet, can discover something very amazing within. Or maybe even the recognition that your mind is not at peace is a good start. And so I'd like to leave that as an exercise for people to start to work on. If you cannot heal yourself, and if you cannot find ways to heal, if you cannot find ways to still the mind and to be able to see things beyond the facade and the illusions, then we're doing ourselves an injustice. And it is not something new either. When the ancestors came from the farm, you wonder why they just lie on the hammock doing nothing, or just sit there, just pause. Those moments of pausing could produce great effects on one's healing, on oneself. So I'm just throwing that as an kind of a psychological tip, but very profound and very important.
Excellent, excellent.
Much appreciated.
Excellent.
Much appreciated.
Aoife, before we leave, I would like to throw in a little bit of talk on the GoFundMe fundraising Wachari Enterprises doing. So there's a GoFundMe going around on the internet right now. It's for Wachari Enterprises, and I ask that we support it as Garinago. It doesn't matter how much you put in there. The point is, I would like you to recognize the GoFundMe and understand that it's a Garifuna initiative, food sustainability, and it's for us by us. All right. So don't worry about the amount. Just recognize the GoFundMe and support the movement.
Excellent, excellent. So we'll be back again as usual every Monday. We'll be at this spot on Wachari Nation Building Monday Live, and I look forward, especially the direction we're taking this discussion about the unlearning and the relearning. I look forward to it. So next week we'll be here again 7:30 for Wachari Nation Building Monday Live.
Thanks very much.
Ayo. Peace.
Ayo.